The Galactic Assembly's Grand Chamber fell silent as the human delegation entered. Their arrival had been anticipated for weeks, ever since their ships had been detected at the edge of civilized space. The assembled representatives of over 300 spacefaring civilizations watched, their various sensory organs fixed on the newcomers. Ambassador Vereen of the Centauri Confederation leaned forward, her crystalline form refracting the chamber's ambient light. Like many others, she had expected the humans to arrive in elaborate environmental suits or showcase advanced technology. Instead, they walked in wearing simple gray uniforms, their bare faces exposed to the carefully regulated atmosphere. "Rather disappointing, wouldn't you say?" whispered Coordinator Exthal, his vapor form condensing slightly in amusement. "No weaponry, no defensive systems, not even basic environmental shielding." Vereen said nothing, her attention fixed on the human's gait. They moved with an unsettling efficiency, each step precisely calculated. No wasted energy, no flourish, no attempt to impress. It was, she realized, the walk of predators. The human delegation took their assigned seats without ceremony. No formal introductions, no diplomatic overtures, no requests for recognition. Their leader, who had only identified herself as Observer Kane, sat perfectly still, watching the proceedings with unnerving focus. The Assembly's High Speaker, Grand Archon Zaltax, raised all four of his primary appendages in the traditional greeting. "We welcome our human guests to this august gathering of civilized species. As is customary, you may present your credentials and petition for observer status." Observer Kane stood. Her voice, when it came, was measured and clear. "We are already observing. No petition is required." The chamber erupted in murmurs and electromagnetic pulses of surprise. Zaltax's appendages twitched in barely contained outrage. That is not how things are done here. There are protocols, traditions that have maintained peace for millennia." "Your protocols are noted," Kane replied. "We will continue our observation." The Mercantile Collective's representative, a being of pure energy contained within an ornate vessel, pulsed with indignation. "You cannot simply declare yourselves observers. The Assembly must vote, must evaluate your species' readiness for galactic society." Kane turned her head slightly, fixing the energy being with a steady gaze. "We are not here to be evaluated. We are here to evaluate." The statement hung in the air like a blade. Vereen felt her crystalline structure vibrate with unease. In all her centuries of diplomatic service, she had never encountered such directness. It bordered on threat, yet contained no actual aggression. Perhaps, Vereen found herself speaking, our human colleagues could explain their interest in the Assembly's proceedings. Kane nodded slightly in acknowledgement. "Humanity has recently achieved faster-than-light travel. We have detected numerous signals and signs of intelligent life. Before we decide how to proceed with interstellar relations, we need to understand the current political landscape. Decide how to proceed." Exthal's vapor form swirled in agitation. "The Assembly decides. We have protocols, standards for technological advancement, cultural development, species maturity." "Your standards are your own," Kane interrupted. "We will observe, analyze, and make our own determinations." The chamber descended into chaos. Various species began broadcasting their outrage across multiple frequencies. Several energy-based beings pulsed so violently their containment vessels crackled. Even the usually stoic silicon-based representatives began resonating in distress. Through it all, the human delegation sat quietly, watching, taking notes, making their determinations. Later that evening, in her private chambers, Vereen reviewed the security recordings of the humans' arrival. She focused on their ships, currently holding position just outside the Assembly Station's defensive perimeter. Simple designs, almost crude by galactic standards. No visible weapons arrays, minimal shielding, basic propulsion systems. Yet something about them made her crystalline spine vibrate with unease. The ships, like their crews, showed no sign of defensive or offensive capabilities. No sign of any capabilities at all. It was as if They're not trying to hide their strength, she whispered to herself. They're hiding the fact that they don't need to show it. The next day, when the assembly convened to discuss the human situation, Observer Kane and her delegation were already seated. No one had seen them enter. The chamber's security systems had no record of their arrival. They were simply there. The message was clear. The humans would observe, whether the assembly approved or not. And there was nothing anyone could do about it. As the session descended into arguments about protocol and procedure, Vereen noticed Kane making notes on a simple electronic device. The human's expression hadn't changed, but for a moment, Vereen thought she saw something like disappointment in those alien eyes. She realized, with a crystalline shudder, that humanity wasn't here to join galactic civilization. They were here to decide if galactic civilization was worth joining at all. 3 months after humanity's arrival at the Galactic Assembly, the Rigel Centauri dispute erupted into open warfare. The conflict, ostensibly over mining rights in the Omega sector, had been simmering for decades. Now, with both species deploying their battle fleets, the Assembly faced its first major crisis since the humans began their observation. Ambassador Vereen watched the holographic display with growing concern as red indicators marked another destroyed trading outpost. The Rigelians, arthropoid beings known for their tactical brilliance, had outmaneuvered the Centaurid forces again. Her own people's colonies lay dangerously close to the conflict zone. "We must intervene," Grand Archon Ziltax declared, his appendages weaving complex patterns of distress. "The Assembly cannot allow such barbarism to continue. I propose an immediate peacekeeping force. The Assembly lacks the authority to intervene." Observer Kane's voice cut through the chamber. The human delegation had remained silent through weeks of debate, but now Kane stood, her expression neutral as always. "Neither the Rigelians nor the Centauri have requested Assembly mediation." Authority. Exthal's vapor form crackled with indignation. "We are the Galactic Assembly. We have maintained peace for millennia through collective action." "You have maintained the illusion of peace," Kane corrected. "Your peacekeeping forces are drawn from member states, each with their own agendas. Your interventions merely add new layers to existing conflicts." The chamber erupted in protests, but Kane continued, her voice somehow carrying over the chaos without rising in volume. "We have reviewed your historical records. 87% of Assembly peacekeeping missions resulted in prolonged occupations. 63% led to economic dependencies that persist to this day." Vereen felt her crystalline structure vibrate with a mix of anger and uncomfortable recognition. The human was not wrong, but to state it so boldly. "Then what would you suggest?" she found herself asking. "Should we simply allow them to destroy each other?" Kane turned those unsettling eyes toward her. "If that is their choice." Before anyone could respond, the chamber's main display lit up with urgent alerts. The Rigelian fleet had launched a major offensive, pushing deep into Centauri space. Casualty reports began flooding in. "Now you see." Ziltax gestured frantically at the displays. "This is what happens without Assembly oversight. Without our peacekeepers. Without interference." Kane interrupted. "They must face the consequences of their choices." As if on cue, new signals appeared on the display. Massive energy signatures, unlike anything in the Assembly's records, emerged at the edge of the conflict zone. The human delegation's devices chimed softly in unison. "What are you doing?" Exthal demanded, his vapor form swirling in agitation. "Observing," Kane replied, from a closer position. The energy signatures resolved into images that made Vereen's crystalline form resonate with shock. Human ships, but not the simple vessels that had brought them to the Assembly. These were something else entirely, massive dark constructs that seemed to bend space around them. They took up positions around the conflict zone, maintaining equal distance from both Rigelian and Centauri forces. They didn't transmit any warnings or demands. They simply watched. The effect was immediate and profound. Both fleets began to pull back, their commanders suddenly uncertain. The simple act of being observed, truly observed, by the silent human vessels seemed to drain the momentum from their conflict. "What are those ships?" Vereen whispered. "Observation platforms," Kane replied. "Nothing more. Nothing more." Exthel's form flickered in disbelief. "Those vessels are radiating enough power to destabilize a star." "Yes," Kane agreed. "We believe in thorough observation." Over the next few days, the Regelian and Centaurid forces continued their gradual withdrawal. No shots were fired, no threats made. The human ships maintained their positions, silent and watchful. A week later, representatives from both species requested private negotiations, away from both assembly oversight and human observation. The conflict that had threatened to engulf an entire sector ended not with assembly peacekeepers or diplomatic protocols, but with the simple, terrifying awareness that something far more powerful was watching. In the assembly chamber, Vereen noticed Kane making notes again. "May I ask what you're recording?" Kane looked up, and for the first time, Vereen saw something like approval in those alien eyes. "We're noting that some species can recognize the value of self-determination when properly motivated." "By fear?" Vereen asked. "By awareness," Kane corrected. "Fear is a crude tool. Awareness. Awareness changes everything." The human delegation continued their quiet observation of assembly proceedings, but something had changed. The other species now watched the humans as intently as the humans watched them. And in that watching, a new kind of peace began to take shape, one based not on assembly protocols or peacekeeping forces, but on the simple, sobering awareness that somewhere in the darkness between stars, humanity was always observing. The Mercantile Collective's emergency session was unprecedented. For the first time in its 1,000-year history, all 17 trade princes had assembled in person rather than through proxies. The reason for their panic floated on the main display: market projections showing the complete collapse of the galactic economy within 6 months. "It's impossible," Trade Prince Angstver declared, his energy form pulsing erratically within its containment field. "No species could possibly produce quantum processors at these prices. The humans must be lying." Ambassador Vereen studied the data with growing unease. Her crystalline form refracted patterns of anxiety as she processed the implications. The humans had quietly entered the galactic market 3 weeks ago. No announcements, no trade negotiations, no requests for market access. They simply began selling. "They're not lying," Observer Kane stated from her usual position in the observation gallery. The human delegation had begun attending economic sessions with the same unnerving focus they'd brought to political meetings. "We are simply more efficient." Efficient. Trade Prince Textile's containment field crackled with outrage. "You're selling quantum processors at 1/10 the production cost. You're offering antimatter storage systems below the cost of raw materials." "Your production costs," Kane corrected. "Your raw material prices." The Trade Prince's collective agitation made the chamber's electromagnetic fields fluctuate wildly. Vereen noticed several silicon-based representatives beginning to resonate in harmony with the disturbance. "This will destroy centuries of established trade relationships," Angstver protested. "The entire galactic economy is based on carefully regulated technological exchange." Kane's expression remained neutral. "Perhaps your economy requires revision." Before anyone could respond, new alerts flashed across the display. Human merchants had just opened trading posts in 50 new systems simultaneously. They were offering not just advanced technology, but something even more disruptive: knowledge. "You're providing manufacturing specifications?" Vereen asked, her crystalline structure vibrating in shock. "Freely?" "Knowledge should not be hoarded," Kane replied. "Any species capable of understanding the principles can replicate our methods." The chamber erupted in chaos. The Mercantile Collective had maintained its power through carefully controlled technological diffusion. Species were granted access to advanced technology only after centuries of proven reliability and economic integration. Now the humans were simply giving away secrets that had been traded like precious gems for millennia. This is a violation of all established protocols. Zextil's containment field was now sparking dangerously. The Assembly must intervene. The Assembly, Kane observed quietly, has no authority over human trade policies. Vereen watched as more data poured in. Human trading posts were accepting all forms of payment, including technologies and resources previously considered worthless. They were trading with species that had been deemed too primitive for advanced commerce. They were even offering technical education to races that had been deliberately kept dependent on collective maintenance contracts. "You're dismantling the entire galactic economic order," she realized aloud. "No," Kane corrected. "We're allowing it to dismantle itself. Your economic system is based on artificial scarcity and controlled access. Such systems are inherently unstable." New projections appeared on the display. Markets were already adapting. Species that had been economic vassals for generations were suddenly developing their own manufacturing capabilities. Worlds that had been resource-poor under the old system were discovering new value in previously worthless materials. "This will cause chaos," Trade Prince Enxvir warned. "Without proper economic controls, lesser species will advance too quickly. They'll develop technologies they're not ready for." "Who decided they weren't ready?" Kane asked. The question hung in the air like a blade. Who benefits from keeping them dependent? The trade princes fell silent, their energy forms dimming slightly. Vereen felt a resonance of understanding ripple through her crystalline form. The humans weren't just introducing new economic policies. They were exposing the fundamental inequities of the existing system. "There will be failures," Kane continued. "Species will make mistakes. Some will advance rapidly, others will struggle. But they will do so on their own terms, not according to artificial constraints imposed by others." "And what do humans gain from this?" Vereen asked. Kane's lips curved in what might have been a smile. "We gain knowledge. Every species that develops independently, that finds new solutions to old problems, adds to the sum of galactic understanding. We believe the universe is too vast and varied for any one approach to be sufficient." As the trade princes descended into frantic discussions about market stabilization and economic controls, Vereen noticed something curious. The human trading posts weren't just selling and sharing. They were watching, recording, learning. Each transaction, each technological adaptation, each cultural response was being carefully documented. "You're still observing," she realized. "Always," Kane agreed. "The way a species handles sudden access to advanced technology tells us more about them than centuries of controlled development ever could." The galactic economy didn't collapse as the mercantile collective had feared. Instead, it transformed. New trade networks emerged, bypassing traditional power structures. Species that had been economic rivals for centuries found themselves cooperating to understand and implement human technologies. The careful hierarchy of technological access that had maintained power for millennia crumbled in months. And through it all, the humans watched, learned, and shared, their true purpose still a mystery that kept Vereen awake through many regeneration cycles. They were changing everything, not through force or coercion, but through the simple act of refusing to play by rules they hadn't agreed to. The swarm emerged from dark space without warning. Billions of crystalline entities moving as one consciousness, consuming everything in their path. They weren't interested in conquest or negotiation. Their only drive was to feed and multiply. 3 major systems fell in the first week alone. The Assembly's response was predictably chaotic. Emergency sessions devolved into accusations and panic as the swarm continued its advance. Trade routes collapsed. Refugee ships overwhelmed border stations. Ancient defense pacts crumbled as species retreated to protect their core worlds. Ambassador Vereen watched the disaster unfold with a sense of crystalline despair. Her own people's home system lay directly in the swarm's path. The Centauri defense fleet, once considered among the most powerful in the galaxy, had been shattered in hours. Throughout the crisis, the human delegation maintained their usual silence. Observer Kane continued taking notes, seemingly unbothered by the reports of devastation. It wasn't until the swarm reached the Proxima sector, just 2 jumps from Earth, that she finally spoke. "We have completed our observations," Kane announced, interrupting another futile debate about evacuation protocols. "We are ready to share our conclusions." The chamber fell silent. Even Grand Archon Zultax's constant appendage movement stilled. Conclusions. Hexthal's vapor form swirled in barely contained rage. "Billions are dying while you take notes, and you want to share conclusions." "Yes," Kane replied, standing. "We have observed your response to this crisis. It has confirmed our initial assessments of galactic civilization." She paused, and for the first time, Vereen saw something like sadness in those alien eyes. "You are not ready." "Not ready?" Vereen found herself asking. "Not ready for what?" "For the truth about the galaxy." Kane's words carried a weight that seemed to bend the space around her. "The swarm is not a natural phenomenon. It is a test." The chamber erupted in confusion, but Kane continued, her voice somehow cutting through the chaos without raising in volume. "We encountered our first swarm 300 years ago. We learned then what you're learning now, that the galaxy is not simply a place of trade and politics. It is an arena. Species are tested. Those who pass survive. Those who fail." She gestured at the holographic displays showing the swarm's devastation. You knew this was coming." Zultax's appendages twisted in patterns of horror. "You let this happen." "We had to know how you would respond," Kane explained. "Your assembly, your trade networks, your carefully maintained balance of power, we needed to see if they would hold against a real threat. They did not." As if on cue, new signals appeared on the strategic display. Massive energy signatures, dwarfing even the observation platforms that had overseen the Rigelian Centauri dispute. The human ships that emerged from hyperspace were unlike anything Vereen had ever seen. They seemed to exist in multiple dimensions at once, their geometries defying conventional physics. "The swarm you face is the 4th we have encountered," Kane continued. "We have contained the others. We will contain this one. But first, you needed to understand your own limitations." The human fleet engaged the swarm with terrifying efficiency. They didn't fight so much as rewrite the laws of physics around their targets. Entire sections of the swarm simply ceased to exist, their component atoms dispersed across multiple dimensions. Others found themselves trapped in temporal loops, endlessly repeating the moment of their defeat. "All this time," Vereen whispered, her crystalline form resonating with understanding, "you weren't just observing us. You were protecting us." "Yes," Kane acknowledged. "Humanity learned long ago that advanced civilizations have a responsibility to those still developing. But protection without understanding leads to dependency. We needed to know if you were ready to learn the truth, that the galaxy is far more dangerous and far more wonderful than your assembly ever imagined." The swarm was defeated within days. The human fleet made it look effortless, almost elegant. But they didn't stop there. Their ships began appearing at every world affected by the crisis, offering aid and restoration, not through their advanced technology, but by teaching the local species how to rebuild themselves. "And now?" Vereen asked as the assembly struggled to process the implications of everything they had witnessed. "What happens to us?" Kane's expression softened slightly. "Now you have a choice. You can return to your comfortable illusions, rebuild your power structures, and wait for the next test to find you unprepared. Or you can accept that the universe is not what you thought it was, and begin learning how to face it." She paused, looking out at the assembled representatives of galactic civilization. "We will continue to observe and protect when necessary, but we will not shield you from the truth any longer. The galaxy is not a garden to be tended, but a wilderness to be explored. The only question is whether you're ready to step beyond your carefully maintained borders and explore it with us." The chamber was silent for a long moment. Then Vereen, her crystalline form glowing with determination. "Stood. Teach us," she said simply. Others joined her, one by one. Not all. Some species withdrew from the assembly entirely, retreating into isolation. But those who remained found themselves facing a new reality, one where humanity's role was not that of a newcomer to be evaluated, but a guardian who had been waiting for them to be ready for the truth. 1 year after the swarm crisis, the Galactic Assembly Chamber looked very different. Gone were the ornate displays of power and the elaborate protocols that had governed proceedings for millennia. In their place was something both simpler and more profound, a gathering of species united not by rules and traditions, but by a shared understanding of their place in a much larger universe. Ambassador Vereen, newly appointed as head of the Interspecies Learning Coalition, found herself studying the changes with her crystalline senses. The human delegation still maintained their observer seats, but they were no longer alone in their role. Other species had adopted similar positions, watching and learning from each other without the artificial hierarchies of the past. The Regelian Centauri Trading Cooperative reports another successful quarter, she announced to the gathered representatives. The same species that had nearly destroyed each other a year ago were now leading the galaxy in collaborative technological development. Their joint research into dimensional physics has already yielded 3 breakthroughs in sustainable energy production. Observer Kane nodded slightly, making her usual notes. But now Vereen understood what those notes meant. Not just observations of galactic civilization, but assessments of their readiness for the next stage of cosmic awareness. The Mercantile Collective's reformation program continues to exceed expectations. Exfil added, his vapor form now stable and controlled. The former trade princes had transformed their economic empire into an open knowledge exchange, helping lesser developed species advance at their own pace. 17 formerly restricted worlds have achieved full technological independence. But not all the news was positive. Grand Archon Zultax, his appendages moving in patterns of concern, reported on the species that had chosen isolation. The Proxians have sealed their borders completely. The hegemony of strict order has declared all human knowledge forbidden. We estimate 20% of former assembly members have rejected the new reality entirely. As is their right, Kane observed. Freedom includes the freedom to refuse growth. Vereen had come to appreciate the subtle wisdom in human statements like these. Their role as guardians didn't mean forcing their protection on others. It meant allowing species to make their own choices, even if those choices led to stagnation. There are rumors, she said carefully, of other tests approaching, different from the swarm, but equally challenging. Kane's expression remained neutral, but her eyes held a glimmer of approval. There are always tests. The universe has many teachers, not all of them as diplomatic as humanity. And will you help us face these challenges? Exfil asked, his form shimmering with concern. No, Kane replied simply. We will continue to observe, to guide when asked, to protect when necessary. But you must face each test yourselves. That is how species grow. The chamber absorbed this in thoughtful silence. A year ago, such a statement would have caused panic. Now it was received with understanding. Humanity's protection wasn't meant to be a shield from reality, but a safety net while they learned to face that reality themselves. We have begun identifying potential observer species among our own ranks, Vereen reported. Civilizations that show the capacity for objective analysis and careful judgment. The Centauri Confederation has already established its first observation post in the Outer Rim. The student becomes the teacher, Kane noted with what might have been approval. Not exactly, Vereen corrected, her crystalline form glowing with newfound confidence. We're learning that there is no clear line between student and teacher. Every species has something to contribute, something to learn. The assembly session continued, but it was no longer about power plays or political maneuvering. Species shared their discoveries, their failures, their insights. The humans watched, as they always had, but now their observation was understood for what it truly was, not judgment, but patient guidance. Later, in her private chambers, Vereen reviewed the latest reports from the exploration teams. Species that had once competed for resources were now working together to probe the mysteries of dark space. The galaxy was revealing itself to be far stranger and more wonderful than anyone had imagined. "You knew, didn't you?" she asked Kane, who had joined her for what had become a regular discussion session. "You knew that the real test wasn't the swarm at all." "The swarm was a catalyst," Kane acknowledged. "The true test was how you would respond to the knowledge that came after, whether you would retreat into fear or step forward into understanding." "And did we pass?" Kane's expression softened into what Vereen had learned to recognize as a genuine smile. "You're asking the wrong question. It's not about passing or failing. It's about continuing to grow, to learn, to face each new challenge with wisdom gained from the last." Outside Vereen's window, a group of newly commissioned observation ships prepared to depart. Their crews were mixed, veterans of different species working together, learning from each other's perspectives. They carried no weapons, no defenses beyond those needed for basic survival. Their mission was simply to watch, to learn, and to understand. "The galaxy is changing," Vereen observed. "The galaxy has always been changing," Kane corrected. "You're just finally ready to see it as it truly is." As the observation ships disappeared into hyperspace, Vereen understood that humanity's greatest gift hadn't been their advanced technology or their protection from the swarm. It had been something far simpler and more profound. The understanding that the universe was not a place to be conquered or controlled, but a vast classroom where every species, even humanity itself, remained eternally both student and teacher. The human delegation continued their quiet observation of galactic civilization, but now their presence was a comfort rather than a mystery. They were not overlords or conquerors, but guides helping younger species navigate the dangerous waters of cosmic existence. And in their patient watching, their careful guidance, they taught perhaps the most important lesson of all, that true power lay not in domination, but in the wisdom to know when to act and when to simply observe.